We had $14 between us, a rusty key, and a family that practically wanted us dead. When the floorboards of Grandpa's rotting cabin finally gave way, we didn't just find salvation, we unearthed a twisted family secret that proved the people who disowned us were hiding something terrifying. If you had told me a year ago that my survival would depend on a dilapidated, off-the-grid shack in the Appalachian Mountains, I would have called you insane. But desperation has a funny way of rewriting your reality. My name is Juliet. My brother, Ronald, and I were born into the Hastings family, a name that means a lot if you're swimming in the high-stakes commercial real estate circles of Boston. Our father, Richard Hastings, built an empire on ruthless acquisitions and corporate bullying. To him, family wasn't a bond, it was a business asset. You either fell in line and contributed to the bottom line, or you were a liability. Ronald and I were liabilities. Ronald had the audacity to drop out of his Ivy League law program to pursue architectural preservation, entirely rejecting Dad's corporate development firm. I lasted a bit longer working in Dad's acquisitions department until I found out he was illegally strong-arming elderly tenants out of a rent-controlled building in South Boston. When I threatened to blow the whistle to the city housing authority, my own father didn't just fire me, he annihilated me. Within 48 hours, our trust funds were legally dissolved. My father's lawyers froze my bank accounts under the guise of an embezzlement investigation, a complete fabrication, but one that tied up my funds indefinitely. Our mother, Diane, a woman whose entire personality was dictated by her country club status, stood by silently and blocked our phone numbers. We were officially disowned, cast out, erased from the Hastings legacy. The descent into poverty was brutal and blindingly fast. By November, Ronald and I were living out of his battered 2008 Honda Civic. We parked in well-lit Walmart parking lots, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. We ate dry ramen noodles because we had no way to boil water. The bitter New England cold seeped into our bones, and the psychological weight of knowing our own parents had orchestrated our ruin was suffocating. We were drowning, and no one was coming to throw us a lifeline. Then, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my burner phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Is this Juliet Hastings?" a dry, raspy voice asked. "This is Gregory Harrison, attorney at law. I was the legal counsel for your grandfather, Aiden Hastings. I regret to inform you that he passed away earlier this week. Grandpa Aiden. I hadn't seen him since I was 10 years old. He was my father's dad, but the two of them had a catastrophic falling out decades ago. Grandpa Aiden had retreated to the woods of North Carolina, becoming a recluse. My father always told us Aiden was a paranoid schizophrenic who drank himself to death, a stain on the family name that we were never to mention. I am executing his will tomorrow," Mr. Harrison continued. "Your presence is required." We scraped together enough change for gas and drove to the lawyer's office in downtown Boston. When we walked into the polished mahogany conference room, in our unwashed clothes and worn-out coats, the disgust in the room was palpable. My father, Richard, was there, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my college tuition. My Uncle Thomas sat beside him, sneering openly. They didn't even look us in the eye. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading. Grandpa Aiden's estate was surprisingly substantial, nearly $4 million in liquid assets and stocks. My father and uncle practically salivated. And true to form, they got it all. The money, the stocks, the vintage cars. "And to my grandchildren, Juliet and Ronald," Mr. Harrison read, his voice dropping an octave. "I leave the property located at 414 Black Mountain Ridge, North Carolina. The deed, and everything within the cabin's walls, is yours. May it serve you better than it served me." Uncle Thomas let out a cruel, barking laugh. "The old man's hoarder cabin! Outstanding! You two finally have a home." My father stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He finally looked at me, his eyes dead and cold. "You should sell it for scrap wood, Juliet. It's fitting. Trash. Inheriting trash." They walked out, leaving us with a manila envelope. Inside was a crumbling, yellowed deed and a heavy, rusted iron key. We were heartbroken. We had hoped, irrationally, for a few $1,000s, just enough to get an apartment and a warm meal. Instead, we inherited a worthless, rotting shack in the middle of nowhere. "What do we do?" Ronald whispered, staring at the key. I looked at him, seeing the dark circles under his eyes, the way his cheekbones jutted out from starvation. We drive to North Carolina, I said. At least it has a roof. At least it's ours. The drive to Black Mountain took almost 20 hours. The Civic sputtered and choked up the steep, winding Appalachian roads. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the cell service dropped to zero. The towering pines seemed to close in around us, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked asphalt. We finally turned onto an unmarked dirt road that had been severely washed out by recent storms. We had to abandon the car a mile out and hike the rest of the way, carrying what little we owned in trash bags. When we finally saw the cabin, my heart sank into my stomach. It was worse than Uncle Thomas had described. It sat in a dark clearing, swallowed by overgrown, thorny vines. The wood was black with rot, the porch roof sagging like a broken jaw. The windows were caked in decades of grime, and strange, crude symbols were carved deeply into the heavy oak front door. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a place where terrible things happened. I shoved the heavy iron key into the lock. It took both Ronald and me throwing our shoulders against the wood to get the door to groan open. The smell hit us instantly, a suffocating wave of mildew, dust, and something sharply metallic, like dried copper. We stepped inside, coughing, waving away the thick cobwebs. The interior was a nightmare. Grandpa Aiden hadn't just been a recluse. He was obsessively paranoid. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, completely crammed with jars of screws, old newspapers dating back to the 1980s, and bizarre, rusted mechanical parts. But what made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up were the windows. Every single one had been boarded up from the inside with heavy steel plates. "What was he hiding from?" Ronald muttered, shining his dying phone flashlight across the room. "Or what was he trying to keep inside?" I replied, shivering. We spent the first night huddled together on a disgusting, moth-eaten mattress we found in the corner. I barely slept. The cabin groaned and settled in the wind, sounding like footsteps pacing just outside the walls. Several times, I thought I heard a low, rhythmic scratching coming from beneath the floor, but I convinced myself it was just raccoons. The next morning, driven by gnawing hunger and a desperate need to make the place livable, we started clearing out the trash. The plan was to find anything of remote value, an antique lamp, old tools, and pawn them in town to buy groceries. By mid-afternoon, we were exhausted and covered in black dust. Ronald was clearing a stack of heavy wooden crates in what looked like a makeshift study when he suddenly stopped. "Juliet, come here," he called out. His voice was trembling. I rushed over. Ronald was pointing at the floor where the crates had been. The floorboards here were different from the rest of the cabin. They weren't rotting pine. They were thick, polished mahogany, laid down in an intricate, almost seamless herringbone pattern. But that wasn't what caught Ronald's attention. In the center of the mahogany boards was a small, perfectly circular indentation, barely the size of a dime, and the wood around it was severely scratched, as if someone had spent years prying at it. "Hand me that crowbar," I said, my pulse suddenly racing. Ronald passed me a rusted iron pry bar we had found in the kitchen. I wedged the flat edge into the microscopic seam between the mahogany boards and leaned my entire body weight onto it. The wood groaned, resisting fiercely, until finally crack. A section of the floor, about 3 feet wide, popped upward. We scrambled to our knees, grabbing the edges of the heavy wood and heaved it aside. A cloud of ancient dust billowed up, stinging our eyes. We waved it away, peering into the dark cavity beneath the floor. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a perfectly square, concrete-lined vault, and sitting in the center of it was a massive, military-grade steel lockbox. It was pristine, completely untouched by the dampness and rot of the cabin. Stenciled on the top in faded yellow paint were the letters, A. Hastings, in case of the wolves. My hands shook as I reached down and gripped the handle. It was incredibly heavy, taking both of us to lift it out of the vault and drag it onto the floor. It was secured by a heavy brass padlock. "Stand back," Ronald said. He raised the iron crowbar high above his head and brought it down violently on the padlock. Sparks flew. He hit it again and again, adrenaline fueling his starved muscles until the brass shackle finally snapped with a sharp ping. We looked at each other, barely daring to breathe. Slowly, I unlatched the heavy steel clasps and flipped the lid open. Inside, there was no dust. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Neatly stacked on the left side were thick, bound leather journals, their spines worn from use. In the center lay a velvet pouch, heavy and clinking with what sounded like metal. But it was what lay on the right side that made my blood run instantly cold. It was a stack of legal documents, crisp and perfectly preserved. On the very top was a notarized contract, bearing the unmistakable, aggressive signature of our father, Richard Hastings. Attached to the contract was a series of black and white photographs. I picked up the first photo with trembling fingers. It was a picture of our father, looking much younger, standing in front of a burning building. Handing him a thick briefcase was a man I didn't recognize. But the insignia on the briefcase was one I knew all too well. It was the logo of the criminal syndicate that ran the underground ports in Boston. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note in Grandpa Aiden's erratic scrawl. Richard burned the South Side tenements. He killed those people for the insurance money to start his empire. The proof is all here. If he ever comes for the kids, use this to destroy him. Ronald snatched the velvet pouch and dumped its contents onto the floor. Dozens of heavy, gleaming gold Krugerrand coins spilled out, rolling across the dusty wood. There had to be at least $100,000 in gold alone. We weren't just given a cabin. Grandpa Aiden had given us a war chest, and he had handed us the very weapon we needed to tear down the man who had destroyed our lives. For a long time, neither of us moved. The heavy gold coins lay scattered across the dust of the rotting floorboards, gleaming in the harsh beam of Ronald's phone flashlight. But it wasn't the gold that held me captive. It was the chilling reality of the black and white photographs and the stark, undeniable proof of our father's monstrosity. Richard Hastings wasn't just a ruthless corporate shark. He was a murderer. "The South Side tenements," Ronald whispered, his voice cracking as he picked up one of the brittle newspaper clippings Grandpa Aiden had saved. "Juliet, I remember this. I was just a kid, but it was all over the news in the late 90s. The police ruled it an electrical fault. 14 people died. 2 of them were children." I grabbed the ledger from the lockbox and began flipping through the crisp pages. Grandpa Aiden had documented everything with obsessive, terrifying precision. According to his notes, our father's real estate firm was completely bankrupt in 1998. Desperate for capital, Richard took out a massive, heavily inflated insurance policy on the dilapidated tenement buildings he owned in South Boston. 3 weeks later, they burned to the ground. The journals detailed how Aiden discovered the truth. He found the payoff receipts to a known syndicate arsonist named Declan O'Rourke. When Aiden confronted his son, threatening to go to the authorities, Richard didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he looked at his father and promised that if Aiden ever breathed a word to the police, Juliet and Ronald, who were just toddlers at the time, would suffer a tragic, fatal accident. "To protect the children, I became a ghost," Aiden's handwriting read. The ink pressed so deeply into the page it nearly tore the paper. I took the evidence and fled to the mountains. I have lived like a rat in the walls, waiting for the day Richard's greed would finally sever his ties with my grandchildren. The day he throws them to the wolves is the day this box must be opened. Tears, hot and furious, streamed down my face. My father had painted our grandfather as a paranoid, drunken lunatic to discredit him, ensuring no one would ever believe a word he said if he resurfaced. Grandpa Aiden sacrificed his entire life, his reputation, and his sanity to keep us alive. And now, from beyond the grave, he was handing us the sword. "We need cash," I said, wiping my face, my sadness instantly hardening into an icy resolve. "We can't fight a billionaire while starving in a rotting cabin. We take a few of these coins into town tomorrow. We get money, we get technology, and we hire a shark of our own." The next morning, we drove the sputtering Civic into downtown Asheville. We found a high-end estate jeweler owned by a stoic man named Wyatt Brooks. We presented 3 of the gold Krugerrands. Wyatt tested the purity, his eyebrows raising slightly, before handing us an envelope containing $5,800 in crisp $100 bills. It was more money than I had seen in 6 months. First, we bought a hot meal, steaks, and baked potatoes that tasted like absolute heaven after weeks of stale ramen. Then, we hit a Best Buy, purchasing 2 high-performance laptops, encrypted hard drives, and secure burner phones. Finally, we checked into a clean, heavily secured extended-stay motel on the edge of town. The motel room became our war room. We spent 72 hours straight digitizing every single document, photograph, and journal entry. We created multiple encrypted backups, storing them on hidden cloud servers and physical drives. We knew we couldn't just take this to the local Boston police. Our father owned the city. He had judges, police captains, and politicians in his back pocket. We needed the federal government. More specifically, we needed someone who hated Richard Hastings as much as we did. Ronald found him. Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel was a former federal prosecutor who had gone into private practice after a political scandal orchestrated entirely by our father's lobbying firm forced him out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Nathaniel had a reputation as a brilliant, relentless bulldog with a massive axe to grind against Boston's corporate elite. I called his private office line on a Tuesday morning. "Mr. Reed," I said when he answered. "My name is Juliet Hastings, Richard Hastings' disowned daughter." There was a long pause on the other end. "I know who you are, Miss Hastings. It's public knowledge. Your father cut you off. If you're calling for a handout or a pro bono lawsuit to get your trust fund back, you've got the wrong number." "I don't want my trust fund, Mr. Reed," I replied, my voice dead calm. "I want to hand you the physical proof that Richard Hastings ordered the 1,998 Southside tenement fires. I have the arsonist's payoff receipts, the original insurance fraud documents, and photographic evidence. I am handing you the head of the man who ruined your career on a silver platter. Are you interested?" The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Nathaniel spoke, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Where are you?" 3 days later, Nathaniel Reed's private charter touched down at a small regional airport in North Carolina. When we brought him back to the motel and laid the original, yellowed documents, the stenciled lockbox, and the stacks of Grandpa Aiden's leather-bound journals across the cheap laminate table, the veteran lawyer physically stumbled. He had to pull out a chair and sit down, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. For nearly 2 hours, the room was dead silent save for the rustling of brittle paper. Reed scrutinized the black and white photographs of our father standing with Declan O'Rourke, tracing the syndicate insignia with a trembling finger. He read the payoff ledgers, cross-referencing the dates with his own encyclopedic memory of the 1,998 Southside tenement fires. "I chased this ghost for 15 years, Nathaniel finally muttered, removing his glasses and rubbing his face. He looked exhausted, yet practically vibrating with adrenaline. I knew Richard was dirty. The whole U.S. Attorney's Office knew it, but we could never pierce his corporate veil. He insulated himself with shell companies and fall guys. But this isn't just a smoking gun. Juliet, this is a nuclear warhead. Your grandfather kept a shadow ledger of the devil himself." "So how do we deploy it?" Ronald asked, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "We can't just hand this to the Boston PD. Half the precinct captains have offshore accounts funded by his real estate firm." Nathaniel looked up, a predatory, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "We don't go anywhere near the local authorities or the state judges. I am taking this directly to the FBI's Racketeering and Organized Crime Division in Washington. But Richard is a flight risk. If he catches even a whisper of an investigation, he'll shred his hard drives, board his Gulfstream, and vanish into a non-extradition country. We need to trap him in public, inescapably." "Next Friday," I said, pulling up the Boston Herald's website on my laptop. "The Boston Chamber of Commerce is hosting their annual gala at the Copley Plaza Hotel. Dad is the guest of honor. He's receiving the Philanthropist of the Decade Award. The mayor will be there, the governor will be there, and every major news network in New England will be broadcasting the speeches live." "It's poetic," Nathaniel said, snapping the titanium briefcase shut over the documents. "You two need to go shopping. We're going to a party. We used a fraction of the gold money to arm ourselves for battle. We weren't just buying clothes, we were buying psychological armor." Ronald purchased a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit that made him look every bit the formidable Hastings heir. I found a striking, floor-length emerald silk gown that commanded attention. We washed away the grime of the mountain, the smell of the rotting cabin, and the exhaustion of homelessness. When we looked in the mirror, we looked like the elite we were raised to be, but beneath the silk and wool, our hearts beat with the cold, calculated rhythm of pure vengeance. The night of the gala, the Copley Plaza Ballroom was a sickening display of opulent hypocrisy. It was a sea of crystal chandeliers casting golden light over Boston's wealthiest predators, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the clinking of champagne flutes. Ronald and I walked through the heavy brass doors, flanking Nathaniel Reed. The moment we stepped onto the imported rugs, the room seemed to shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. People recognized us instantly. The disowned children, the pariahs who had been publicly scrubbed from the family dynasty, had dared to return to high society. Across the cavernous room, standing on a raised velvet-draped dais with the mayor of Boston, was our father. Richard Hastings looked perfectly in his element, holding a glass of 20-year-old scotch, laughing confidently at a joke the governor had just made. Beside him stood Uncle Thomas, checking his Rolex, and our mother, Diane, dripping in diamonds that were paid for in blood. The mayor tapped the microphone, calling for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor a man whose integrity and commitment to this city have reshaped our skyline. Richard's eyes swept the crowd, soaking in the adoration. And then, his gaze locked onto us. The smug, invincible smile vanished from his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the stage lights. He leaned down, whispering frantically to his head of security. But before the massive men in earpieces could even move toward us, the grand ballroom doors violently blew open. Over 30 federal agents, wearing heavy tactical gear and dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI, flooded the room. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, immediately securing every exit. The orchestra abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The terrified gasps of the elite echoed through the hall. Special agent in charge, Sarah Jenkins, a no-nonsense woman with steel gray hair and a deeply commanding presence, marched directly down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on the stage. Richard Hastings, Agent Jenkins' voice boomed over the stunned, breathless silence of the ballroom. You are under arrest for federal racketeering, massive insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and 14 counts of murder in the first degree. My father's jaw slacked. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly against the microphone stand. For the first time in my life, the untouchable, tyrannical titan of Boston real estate looked utterly terrified. This is absurd, he roared, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. I demand to know who authorized this absolute circus. I will have your badge, Jenkins. I stepped forward from the crowd, leaving Ronald and Nathaniel behind. I walked right up to the edge of the dais, standing shoulder to shoulder with Agent Jenkins. I looked my father dead in his panicked wide eyes. Grandpa Aiden says hello, I said, making sure my voice carried over the dead silence, echoing directly into the microphones of the press corps. Something inside Richard broke. His face twisted into an ugly, feral mask of sheer rage. He lunged at me off the stage, his hands reaching for my throat, but he never made it. 2 federal agents tackled him midair, slamming him face first onto the polished marble floor. The heavy, metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Panic erupted. Uncle Thomas realized what was happening. He shoved past the mayor, knocking the podium over, and sprinted toward the kitchen service doors, desperately trying to flee. But Grandpa Aiden's journals had been incredibly thorough. They detailed exactly how Thomas had laundered the arson money through offshore shell companies. 3 agents intercepted Thomas before he even made it past the ice sculptures, slamming him into the wall and cuffing him. My mother stood frozen on the stage, her hands covering her mouth in horror. She looked down at me, tears streaming down her face, pleading silently for me to help her. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow. She had chosen her side of the war a long time ago. Over the next 6 months, the Hastings Empire was completely, ruthlessly dismantled. The federal trial was the media spectacle of the decade. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence perfectly preserved in the concrete vault of that creepy mountain cabin, Richard's high-priced lawyers were powerless. Richard and Thomas Hastings were found guilty on all 42 federal charges. The judge sentenced them both to consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The government seized the corporate empire, liquidating its massive portfolio to pay tens of millions of dollars in reparations to the surviving families of the victims who perished in the Southside fires. As for Ronald and me, the federal courts officially invalidated the documents that had stolen our trust funds, recognizing them as products of illegal extortion. Millions were returned to our names, but we didn't want a single dime of the dirty Hastings money. We donated the entirety of our trusts to affordable housing charities and community defense funds in South Boston. We kept only one thing: the heavy, velvet pouch of gold Krugerrands Grandpa Aiden had left us. We returned to the quiet, towering pines of North Carolina. Using the gold, Ronald designed and hired a local crew to restore the property on Black Mountain Ridge. We tore down the rotted wood, removed the paranoid steel plates, and built a stunning, light-filled timber frame home over the original foundation. But in the center of the study, we kept the intricate, herringbone mahogany floorboards exactly as they were. They remained a permanent, beautiful reminder of the man who sacrificed everything to protect us from the shadows. We had been disowned, cast out, and left to die in the freezing cold by the people who were supposed to love us. But Grandpa Aiden's secret had given us something Richard Hastings could never buy, steal, or destroy: our complete and total freedom. We weren't the outcasts of the Hastings family anymore, we were its survivors. And that is the true power of a family secret. We went from starving in a car to bringing down a billionaire empire, all thanks to a hidden lockbox beneath the floorboards. If you were captivated by this intense real-life story of betrayal and revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept the gold or turned it all in? Share this video and stay tuned for our next incredible story.
Hi, my name is Kwang Vin, the owner and manager of Royal Whispers. After watching the video, Disowned, we opened Grandpa's creepy cabin. The floorboard treasure saved our lives. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of resilience. The story begins with loss and uncertainty, but it gradually becomes a reminder that hope can appear in the most unexpected places. Sometimes what looks forgotten or abandoned can hold the key to a completely different future. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that perseverance matters, especially during difficult seasons of life. When things seem stacked against us, continuing to move forward can open doors we never expected to find. What part of the story surprised you the most? And do you think the real value was the treasure itself or the journey that led to it? Thank you for spending time with Royal Whispers. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And maybe like or subscribe for more stories about family hidden secrets and unexpected second chances.